That's my timber." The words sliced through the morning air like a threat, and when I turned to see who was yelling, I never imagined it would be the beginning of the worst nightmare of my life. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, and it wasn't about what this was about: control, manipulation, and a neighbor so deranged that she would stop at nothing to claim what was never hers. What started with a woodpile would become the fight of my life, a legal and psychological battle against a woman determined to destroy everything I loved. Stay to the end, because what happens will absolutely shock you, and make sure you subscribe. 2 Sham stories for more real-life HOA horror tales like this one. My name is Mark Thompson, and I'm a third-generation woodworker, inheriting not just the tools of my trade, but also the lakeside cabin that had belonged to my grandfather since the 1960s, set on 2 acres of peaceful Minnesota shoreline. This cabin was more than a retreat. It was home, tradition, memory, and the quiet place where I learned everything about working with my hands. Every summer since I was 8, I'd come here to hone my skills, surrounded by nature and wood grain. I never expected that one day I'd have to defend this place and my legacy from a neighbor bent on tearing it all apart. It was early September, and I was unloading specially selected timber from my truck into the cabin's storage area. This wasn't firewood. These were premium cuts of oak, walnut, maple lumber I'd sourced over the course of 7 years from all over the country, each piece chosen for its grain, tone, and history. I was preparing to build a once-in-a-lifetime furniture set, a tribute to my grandfather's legacy, meant to be passed on to future generations. I was methodically checking each piece when she came Victoria Hartwell. New to the lake community, she'd moved into the sprawling lakefront mansion next door just a few months earlier. We'd exchanged polite waves before, and I'd heard murmurs about her being difficult in her previous neighborhood, but I never thought much of it. That changed when she marched across her property line in high heels, in a fury so misplaced it felt like a performance. She pointed at my woodpile and accused me of stealing her tree, her oak tree, to be precise. I calmly explained that this lumber came from a supplier in Wisconsin, and even offered to show her the receipts and documentation, but she didn't want proof. She wanted to win. She called the police, claiming I had stolen her tree during the night and was trying to haul it off like some kind of lumber thief. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, I presented every piece of evidence: purchase receipts, supplier photos, and transport logs. Deputy Martinez, a seasoned man who'd clearly seen his share of neighborhood drama, confirmed that the wood didn't even resemble local species. Still, Victoria insisted the documents were forged and accused me of lying to law enforcement. They left without taking action, but I saw something in her eyes that chilled me. This wasn't over. The next day, Victoria escalated. Her lawn crew showed up with chainsaws and began clearing our shared property line, pushing several feet into my land. They moved a granite boundary boulder that had marked the edge of my property for decades and began placing orange stakes where they had no business being. I stopped them with a copy of my property survey, and although they backed off, Victoria watched from her deck with smug satisfaction. That night, I called Tom Rivera, a trusted land surveyor I'd worked with during renovations. Confirmed. The boulder had been in place since 1978 and agreed to document everything. When he arrived the next morning, Victoria stormed outside and accused him of trespassing. Tom kept calm and went to work, uncovering deliberate tampering with multiple property markers, including a twin-trunk maple that had stood untouched for 40 years. This wasn't just encroachment, it was attempted land theft. That night, I began reaching out to neighbors. What I found was staggering. In just 3 months, Victoria had filed multiple bogus complaints noise violations, dock encroachments, even a fabricated lawsuit against a young couple for infringing on her water rights. She had driven the previous homeowners to sell after. 6 complaints in 2 months was her pattern. Move in, assert dominance, and use legal threats and HOA pressure to isolate and intimidate others into submission. I documented every incident. Photos, interviews, survey maps, all of it went into a file I was now building to defend myself. Then I took the next step. I hired Anna Mitchell, a fierce attorney known for taking down HOA bullies. When I showed her the boundary violations, the survey, and Victoria's pattern, She looked me in the eye and said, "This isn't just harassment, it's warfare." We sent a cease and desist letter loaded with documentation and legal precedent. Victoria didn't respond legally, she responded online. Within 24 hours, she launched a social media campaign portraying me as a dangerous, aggressive neighbor. She posted staged photos of herself, looking distressed, claimed I'd threatened her over property lines, and accused me of illegal construction. The impact was immediate. Some neighbors turned cold, others unsure of what to believe. A community meeting was called. I arrived prepared. As Victoria sobbed about my so-called threats, I handed out full copies of my property survey, her harassment pattern, and the cease and desist letter. The mood in the room shifted. Neighbors began murmuring, recognizing her manipulations. I stood and explained that my lumber wasn't just firewood, it was a heritage project, part of a 7-year plan to build custom furniture that mirrored my grandfather's masterpieces. And then I dropped the bombshell. The tree she claimed I stole was still standing in her own yard. The room erupted with laughter and disbelief. Her story unraveled, but Victoria didn't stop. She grew more erratic. That night, she sat in her car outside my cabin for hours, watching my workshop like a hawk. I knew the next escalation wouldn't be verbal or legal, it would be violent. So I installed high-definition cameras and motion detectors. I reinforced every point of entry, and I waited, not in fear, but with resolve, because I was going to finish this. She thought she was dealing with some backwoods craftsman. What she didn't realize was that I knew how to plan every cut-tand I never miss. The following morning began deceptively calm, with the lake mist curling across the water like a curtain trying to shield me from what was coming next. But calm was not in Victoria Hartwell's vocabulary, and by 8 a.m., 2 men in suits from the county building inspection office were walking up my driveway with clipboards and stern expressions, informing me they were responding to a series of anonymous complaints about unpermitted construction, environmental code violations, and potential hazardous waste on site. I invited them in without hesitation. Confident in the integrity of my workspace and my records, and while they were clearly expecting something shady or illegal, what they found instead was a neatly organized, regulation-compliant workshop with clearly labeled materials, certified ventilation systems, and a full portfolio of state-licensed design projects I had worked on professionally by the time they left. Not only had they found no violations, but one of them even complimented my dowel joint precision on a half-assembled mahogany armoire. However, I knew better than to consider this a victory, because Victoria wasn't trying to win any legal battles. She was trying to overwhelm, exhaust, and provoke. And what came next confirmed it when I received a certified letter from a local property mediator claiming Victoria had requested binding arbitration over the boundary dispute, complete with a demand that I pay for half of the mediation costs and agree to halt all work on my furniture until it was resolved. Which was ludicrous considering I wasn't the one encroaching on anyone's land. My attorney Anna responded with a flat rejection, citing the ongoing cease and desist order and reaffirming that any further attempts to interfere would be considered malicious prosecution. But it didn't slow Victoria down. Instead, she pivoted to the HOA. And though our lakeside community was traditionally light on rules, she had managed to bully and charm her way onto the advisory board in record time, bringing with her a list of proposed amendments targeting excessive workshop noise, visual inconsistency from wood storage, and the introduction of industrial materials into residential zones, all of which were thinly veiled attacks on my operations. The amendments were so aggressive that they drew immediate resistance from longtime residents, including Mr. Price, an 84-year-old retired judge who had lived here since 1975 and rarely involved himself in neighborhood drama, but who now stood at the next HOA meeting and in his raspy voice asked the room, "When did common sense die?" The crowd murmured in agreement, and although the amendments didn't pass, Victoria's real goal had been achieved. Every week, every day, I was forced to defend myself from some new wave of noise, suspicion, and accusation. I should have been in my workshop, planning dovetail joints, cutting fine slats, and oiling heirloom quality grain. But instead I was reading depositions, scanning security footage, and preparing for whatever madness she was brewing next then. As if to mock the law itself, she put up a privacy fence on her side of the disputed boundary, but built it 3 feet inside my property line. Using cheap, ugly plastic boards that leaned and wobbled with the wind like a toddler's craft project. And when I reported it to the county with survey documents in hand, she filed a harassment complaint against me, stating that I was obsessed with watching her property, even though the camera facing that direction had been installed weeks before the fence appeared. The sheriff's deputy who reviewed the footage had the decency to roll his eyes and quietly assure me that her complaint was going nowhere, but the damage had already been done. My name was in another report, another record, another step in her campaign to paint me as the unstable one. That night, after another long call with Anna discussing trespass, documentation, and fence ordinances, I sat on my porch under the stars, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at the dark silhouette of Victoria's house across the lawn, wondering what drove someone like her to commit to such relentless destruction. Was it loneliness, arrogance, the thrill of dominance? Or was it something deeper, darker, something broken inside her that could only be satisfied by watching someone else crack first? I didn't know, and I didn't care to find out. TIA only cared about finishing what I started. So I returned to my workshop and started working at night, pouring every ounce of stress, anger, and resolve into my designs, letting the rhythm of the tools drown out the echo of her poison. And then, just when I thought the storm was cresting, I found at one of my prized boards a slab of book-matched black walnut I had saved for the dining table centerpiece. It's missing from the drying rack, and after a frantic check of the surrounding area, I found it behind my shed, broken in half. One end stained with what looked like lawn chemicals, and the other buried halfway in mud, clearly sabotaged. The cameras hadn't caught it, likely due to a blind angle I hadn't accounted for. And that mistake enraged me more than the damage itself, not because of the monetary loss, but because that wood had meaning, history, identity, and she had taken a piece of it, defiled it, and thrown it away like trash. It wasn't about property anymore. It was about legacy. And I knew I couldn't let her continue unchecked. I agreed and filed a restraining order, attaching the photos of the destroyed slab along with sworn affidavits from other neighbors about her harassment patterns. But before the order could be reviewed, Victoria filed a criminal complaint against me, claiming that I had tried to poison her dog by leaving chemical-soaked wood on the property line. And when officers showed up with animal control, I knew we had hit the climax. I showed them the footage, the fence placement, the drying rack logs, and explained what the wood had been. And while the officers were clearly skeptical of her claims, the report still had to be made. It was the first time in my life that I was officially listed as the subject of an animal abuse investigation, and the humiliation boiled in my gut like acid. That night I called Anna and said we were done. Waiting, it was time to file a full civil suit for defamation, trespass, property damage, and intentional emotional distress. And she agreed without hesitation, saying we gave her every chance to stop. Now we bring everything. The civil suit we filed was more than just legal retaliation. It was a line in the sand, a declaration that I would no longer play defense in the war Victoria had waged against me and everyone else she viewed as obstacles to her control. And the moment she was served, the entire tone of the neighborhood shifted, as if a weight had been lifted. Not because people expected a quick resolution, but because someone had finally stood up and said, no more. Anna drafted the suit with surgical precision, laying out every incident chronologically, from the false boundary dispute and tampering with survey markers to her online smear campaign, HOA manipulation, fence installation on my land, destruction of property, and false criminal allegations, including the poisoning complaint, each item documented, time-stamped, and backed by photos, video, affidavits, and third-party reports. We served it personally through a private process server, who later told me Victoria had answered the door in a silk robe and tried to claim she didn't receive legal mail. To which he calmly replied, "You have now," and handed her the papers. Within 48 hours, her lawyer, a slick, overly tan man named Gregory Flint, contacted Anna to request a meeting to negotiate terms outside of court, which Anna declined without hesitation. "They're panicking," she said. That's the first sign you've got them. But Victoria's version of panic wasn't retreat. Instead, she escalated again. This time leveraging the HOA in one last desperate attempt to discredit me. Calling an emergency meeting and pushing for a vote to revoke my community access. Privileges meaning I would be banned from shared amenities, like the dock, boat launch, and park space, citing ongoing legal concerns and a breakdown of community trust. But this time, the residents were ready. I had shared everything with them, quietly, respectfully, giving them the evidence and context they needed to see the full picture. On the night of the meeting, the room was packed like never before. Victoria stood at the podium in a white blazer, spinning a dramatic story about neighborhood safety, dangerous tools, and how certain people were abusing the community spirit. But when she finished and opened the floor, what happened next surprised even me. One by one, neighbors stood not just in my defense, but in outright condemnation of her. The Burkes, an elderly couple who'd been too afraid to speak out for months, read a prepared statement about how Victoria had tried to pressure them into voting against me by threatening to report their grandson's excessive weekend visits. As a violation, young mother described how Victoria had accused her of operating an illegal daycare because she babysat her niece after school. Even Mr. Price, the retired judge, walked to the front, held up a copy of my survey and said, "I have lived through real legal battles. What this man has faced is not justice, it's harassment." The vote to revoke my privileges failed 38-2. The two votes in favor were Victoria and one of her remaining cronies, who quietly resigned the next day. With that, the community had spoken, not just in courtrooms, but in the space that mattered most, the place we all called home. But Victoria wasn't finished. In a final, desperate act, she posted flyers across town with my photo, warning residents that I was under investigation for poisoning animals and hoarding dangerous chemicals. Using bold red letters and blurry, selectively cropped images pulled from my own security camera footage she must have accessed by climbing into my backyard and using a Wi-Fi sniffer to hack my network. Because I later discovered several files had been remotely accessed. During a period when I wasn't even home, that was the last straw. I filed a criminal complaint for stalking and cyber intrusion, and Anna added digital privacy violations to our civil case. We subpoenaed her internet records, traced the IP, activity, and confirmed unauthorized access. When the sheriff's department received the report, they assigned it to their cybercrime unit, and suddenly the tone changed from local nuisance to criminal investigation. Victoria must have sensed the noose tightening because she vanished from public view. No more HOA appearances. No more morning patrols. Her lights stayed off, her curtains closed. A for sale sign appeared in her yard just 1 week later, and while it stayed up for several months with no activity, eventually the property was listed under a trust and quietly purchased by a real estate firm. Whether she fled voluntarily or was forced out by financial pressure, legal costs, or pure social exile, no one knew for sure, but one thing was certain. She was gone. Still, the legal process continued. The court date for our civil case was set. Although Victoria attempted twice to delay the hearing, citing mental stress and medical concerns, the judge saw through it and ordered the proceedings to continue as scheduled. When the day arrived, I walked into that courthouse with Anna by my side, armed with 12 months of documentation, 12 months of fear, stress, violations, threats, insults. 12 months of my life spent fighting a woman who should never have been allowed to hold power over a community in the first place. Victoria's legal team tried to paint me as a combative neighbor with a vendetta, but under cross-examination, their argument collapsed. They couldn't explain why I had never once retaliated. They couldn't dismiss the volume of third-party evidence, couldn't argue with video footage, sworn affidavits, and digital logs. When Anna presented the footage of Victoria standing near my woodpile at 3:17 a.m., the same night my slab was destroyed, even the judge leaned forward. When the financial documents showing her personal fence contractor's payment history overlapped with stolen HOA funds from a previous neighborhood's lawsuit settlement, the courtroom audibly gasped when the sheriff's deputy testified that the poisoning complaint against me had been deemed not just unfounded, but fabricated. It was over. The judge ruled in my favor on all counts, defamation, trespass, destruction of property, emotional distress, and digital intrusion. Victoria was ordered to pay damages totaling $126,000, enough to cover my legal fees, the cost of repairing my woodworking materials, and compensation for the projects I lost due to her harassment. The judgment was public. The ruling was firm, and the message was clear. No one is above the law, not even a self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac. I walked out of that courthouse not as a victor, but as a survivor, my hands no longer shaking with fury, but steady with the weight of vindication. The battle had taken a toll, but I had my peace. The months following the court ruling brought a strange but welcome quiet over the lakefront community. A silence not of fear or avoidance, but one of collective exhale, as if the very ground had stopped bracing for confrontation and could finally settle back into place after the storm that had defined our lives for so long. And while Victoria's departure left behind no formal farewell, no apology, and certainly no closure, her absence itself became a kind of relief. One that every neighbor recognized in small, simple ways. Mailboxes were no longer tampered with. The HOA bulletin board no longer featured anonymous accusations. And the board meetings, once battlegrounds of veiled insults and forced policies, it's transformed into reasonable, collaborative discussions where people finally felt safe to speak. Again, the house she once occupied stood empty for nearly 4 months. A ghost structure with drawn curtains and a leaning, a for sale sign that fluttered like a white flag of retreat until eventually a young couple from the city bought it, unaware of its history, their moving truck arriving under a late spring sky while the rest of the neighborhood observed cautiously from a distance, hopeful that the dark energy once rooted in that property would leave with its former owner. I never spoke of Victoria to them, and neither did anyone else. We let them start fresh, just as we were all trying to. But while the outer world returned to normal, internally, I was still healing from the 12-month war that had consumed my time, my focus, and much of the creative energy I once used to express myself through my craft. My workshop, though untouched physically, started to feel haunted by the memories of each confrontation, every legal document, and the many nights I stood over my lumber inventory not to admire the grain but to count what might be missing, compromised, or next in her crosshairs. So I made a decision. One that had been building in my heart since the moment I saw that slab of walnut broken and buried. I would finish what I started. Build the furniture I had planned before any of this madness began, not for profit or validation, but because I needed to reclaim what was mine, not just land and reputation, but purpose, legacy, and peace. The process of creating those pieces became its own therapy. Selected each board not based on value, but on symbolism, choosing materials that had endured, aged well, or bore visible scars and imperfections that could be sanded, shaped, and made beautiful again, just like the cabin, just like me. The dining table, made from white oak with a deep, natural oil finish, became the centerpiece, not just of my home, but of my story space, where one day I would gather family and friends, not to speak of lawsuits or neighbors from hell, but of resilience, craftsmanship, and what it means to stand for something without losing yourself in the process. As I worked, neighbors began to stop by more frequently, some out of curiosity, others to say thank you, and a few just to sit and talk. No longer looking over their shoulders or speaking in hushed tones, but smiling, laughing, and showing signs of the community we once were and could be again. Julia, a retired school teacher who lived 3 houses down and had once been fined by Victoria for using a blue curtain instead of beige, brought me fresh bread every Sunday for months, and during one visit, she admitted that for the longest time she'd felt powerless, invisible even, until I decided to fight back. "You made it okay for the rest of us to say no," she said. I didn't have the heart to tell her how often I'd almost given up, how many nights I sat on my porch wondering if the cost of peace was just too high. But hearing that my stand had mattered reaffirmed everything. Across the lake, word of our victory had spread to neighboring HOAs, and before long, I began receiving messages from complete strangers asking how we had done it, how we had gathered evidence, structured our case, navigated the bureaucracy, and endured the harassment without losing our sanity. I responded to each message personally, not because I considered myself an expert, but because I understood the isolation they were feeling, the helplessness of watching a narcissistic bully twist the rules and manipulate a system designed for community into a weapon of control. I began compiling my documentation into a free public guide, hosted on a simple website I built late at night, titled Standing Up, a guide for HOA abuse victims, which included everything from legal templates and boundary dispute protocols, 2 mental health tips, and community organizing strategies. And to my surprise, it gained traction quickly, shared in forums, newsletters, and eventually featured in a regional magazine that highlighted homeowner rights. Suddenly, I wasn't just a guy with a workbench and a war story. I had become, unintentionally, a symbol of resistance. And while the spotlight was never something I craved, I saw its value, especially when I received a letter from a single mother in Arizona who wrote, "Reading your story gave me the courage to stand up to our HOA president. I printed your guide and showed my neighbors. We're filing our petition this month. Thank you for showing me we're not alone." That letter now sits framed in my workshop above the finished walnut cabinet, the one piece I made from the remaining half of the slab Victoria destroyed. A piece that should have been discarded, but instead became one of the most meaningful creations I've ever completed. The cabinet's top bears a faint stain, a trace of the chemical damage that couldn't be fully removed. But I left it intentionally, sealing it under clear finish as a reminder that not all scars need to be hidden, and some should be embraced. Life on the lake moved on. New families arrived. New traditions began, and the HOA, now, under leadership chosen by real votes and guided by real transparency, became something functional again. Meetings were shorter, agendas clearer, and instead of threats, there were projects, cleanups, and open discussions. No one missed the old way, and when people occasionally mentioned Victoria never by name, always as the situation or the last chapter, it was with the tone one uses. For a natural disaster, something tragic, but behind us. Still, I never let my guard down entirely, not because I expected her return, but because I knew there would always be others like her, in other neighborhoods, in other positions of power, and perhaps even watching from a distance, learning, waiting, ready to see how far they could push before someone finally pushed back. I kept my documents updated, my cameras rolling, and my network secure, not out of paranoia, but out of wisdom hard-earned. And most of all, I kept building, because in the end, creation is the greatest form of resistance to destruction. Every drawer joint I crafted, every corner I sanded, every oil coat I applied was a way of saying, I'm still here, and I'm not afraid. Years later, when the cabin had weathered another dozen winters, and the edge of the dock had been replaced twice over, I found myself sitting in my workshop, surrounded by the same walls that had once echoed with quiet dread, but now held nothing but warmth, cedar, and the low hum of a belt sander smoothing the final edge of a bench I was crafting for Julia's daughter's wedding gift. And it struck me how different everything felt, not just on the surface, but at its core. There was no more fear here, no more tension in the air every time a car slowed down on the gravel drive. No more shadow cast by the paranoid, power-hungry woman who had once tried to bully an entire community into silent submission. The scars she left behind remained. In some ways, neighbors still used phrases like, "Remember back then," when discussing property lines or HOA meetings? But they were no longer wounds. Just reminders of how fragile peace can be and how hard it is. 1. Over time, as the cabin hosted more birthdays, dinners, and small reunions of people who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in HOA meetings, armed with photocopied evidence and shaky voices, it became clear that we had built more than furniture or fences. We had built something invisible but powerful: trust. The young couple who had bought Victoria's old home became close friends. And when I finally told them the full story, they were stunned, having lived in total peace since moving in, unaware that their front yard had once been the front line of a war none of us had wanted but all of us had fought. They asked if I ever regretted not settling sooner, not walking away. And I told them the truth. I regretted every moment I let fear make me question whether I was the problem. Every time I second-guessed my right to exist in peace, to create, to own what I'd earned, because people like Victoria win not when they prove they're right, but when they make you forget you were ever allowed to stand up for yourself in the first place. I kept the court ruling framed in a drawer, not on display, because it wasn't about bragging rights. It was about reminding myself, during the worst days, that truth matters, that patience has value, and that no matter how well someone dresses up control as community, it's still tyranny if it silences others. I still receive letters now and then from strangers victims of HOA abuse, families in neighborhoods where one person's ego had hijacked the rules for personal vendettas, and I replied to every one of them, still sharing the guide I wrote, still offering to talk, because the battle we won in Ocala wasn't just ours, it was part of a much bigger story playing out across small towns, suburbs, and private developments where homeowners quietly suffered under the illusion that their property rights disappeared the moment they paid HOA dues. There was one letter I received from a man in his 60s in Texas who wrote, "I read your story and finally showed my wife the box of letters I'd been hiding from her. I took it to the board. We're not afraid anymore." That one hit hard because I knew exactly what that fear felt, like the kind that makes you question your instincts, your memory, your sanity. The kind that turns your home from a refuge into a war zone with invisible landmines of fines, threats, and shame. But in standing up, that man reclaimed more than peace. He reclaimed truth. And that's what it's really about in the end, isn't it? Not winning, not defeating someone, but restoring the truth to its rightful place in the center of the conversation. Today, the cabin is fully restored and better than it's ever been, filled with handcrafted furniture, walls lined with photographs of family, friends, and community celebrations. The bench I made from that half-ruined walnut slab now sits under the tree Victoria once claimed I cut down. It still stands tall. It's unscarred, a living monument to the lie she built her narrative on, and every now and then when I walk past it, I run my hand across the smooth wood, feel the faint groove where the stain never fully disappeared, and smile not because it's perfect, but because it survived. And that's what I hope people remember most about this story, not the noise, the lawsuits, or even the courtroom victory, but the fact that no matter how loud the bully becomes, the quiet resolve of a person who knows their truth will always outlast them. And if this story reminded you of something you're going through, or gave you the strength to face something you've been avoiding, then don't stop here. Stand up, document everything, stay calm, and never fight alone, because the moment you do, they start to lose their grip. And if you want more real, raw stories like this, stories of standing up, pushing back, and winning your life back from the Karens and the control freaks of the world, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories on YouTube. Join our growing community of everyday people fighting back one story at a time, and let the world know we're done being silent.